We're getting started right on time. I want to welcome everyone today. My name is Billy Ringer. I'm an attorney, an environmental litigator. I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee, and I am an advocate for people. I'm a person who advocates cases in which there's real human loss, and in which we attempt to get justice for people and compensation for those people through litigation. I'm here today with my colleagues, Angela Hind, and she's a physician, an internist, and also an environmental advocate, as I am. We have worked closely together on many cases, none larger than the topic we're going to discuss today, which was the Kingston Coal Ash spill from 2008. Also here with Norman Kleiman, his PhD, and a very impressive professor from the Columbia University. I'm sure that you've heard of that. I've been talking with Norman over the last day that we've been here, and it's incredibly impressive how many different areas of expertise that he is involved in. Truly one of the hardest working professionals that I've ever worked with, and we're very lucky to have him here with us. We've all traveled across the country to be here with you. I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee. Angela Hind is from Asheville, North Carolina, and Norman, of course, is from New York City. So we're happy to be here. We're glad that everyone turned out for the event. We also expected Dr. Elizabeth Ward to be here with us, but she was not feeling well. I did want to mention her. I'd be remiss if I didn't. What we're going to talk about today and the topic of the environmental litigation surrounding the Kingston Coal Ash spill would not have been successful were it not for the massive efforts of Dr. Ward. She is an epidemiology consultant, former senior vice president, intramural research at the American Cancer Society, which I'm sure that you've heard of, and most impressively is the current chair of the World Trade Center Health Program Science Advisory Committee, which is an impressive list of credentials. I think you'll see as we go through our talk today that we, and not to use too much hyperbole, but you will hear some statements to the effect of the greatest or the most impressive or the worst happening in environmental history. And that's really true of what happened at Kingston. But what's also true is that I believe that we put together, and in order to be successful, one of the most impressive expert teams that's ever been assembled in the history of environmental litigation. And I think that you will see that today. So I want to first give you a background of the area itself and what led to this enormous environmental disaster. Everyone come on in. Thank you. So this occurred in Roane County, Tennessee, which is an area in the eastern portion of Tennessee in the Appalachian Mountains, very close to the highest point in the Appalachian Mountains in the southern end. This is an area in which there's a lot of great beauty, a lot like, and it reminded me a lot of Eugene. And this is an area where people vacation from all around the country. It's close to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and it's just a scenic, beautiful place to be. I call it my home. I've lived in East Tennessee for 22 years by choice, and I travel all around the country to do the types of litigation that I do, but that's where I hang my hat, and it's for a reason, because it is so beautiful. This is the Emory River watershed, but it also connects with what we're going to talk about, the Clinch River. And at the mouth of that is what we call the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority Kingston Fossil Plant. And that is the subject of today's talk, which is a huge coal-fired power plant that was originally commissioned back in 1951. To go back even further, Tennessee Valley Authority was a New Deal era organization put together so that power could be generated throughout this region through governmental support. Over time, TVA has become a pseudo-public, pseudo-private entity which is allowed to profit for itself, and it does. During that time, and when they finished this power plant in 1955, it was the largest coal-fired power plant in the world, and it's still today in the top 10 largest coal-fired power plant in the world. Every day they burn, listen to this, 1,200 tons of coal, producing 1,200 tons of coal ash every single day. And that happens today, and it's been happening. So over a 50 to 60 year span between 1955 and 2008, 1,200 tons of coal ash were being produced and dumped into what we call slurry ponds, open air, liquid-filled ponds in which coal ash, which is the byproduct of burning coal for the electricity, and where that was stored. The reason they did that is because of what we've known for years, which is that burning coal burns off all of the organic materials and leaves behind a really extensive conglomeration of heavy metals and other toxic materials. And these things do not burn off, and they don't go anywhere. Now, back in the 1970s, before we were recognizing the extent of what was being pumped out, this just used to be all blown into the atmosphere and was affecting nearby communities. Over time, there were studies done, which we're going to talk about today, that recognized that just putting those particles into the atmosphere was affecting human health in certain communities. Well, they began regulating this during those 1970s and 80s period and put what's called scrubber into their smokestacks. Well, that began producing a lot more of what we call fly ash, which is the ash that is dumped now. It's the byproduct that is dumped into these slurry ponds. If you look into the section here of the slide, you can see these huge ponds that are sitting outside of the coal-fired power plant. Essentially, all of the ash that was collected out of the stacks was just transported and dumped into these things for years, and put in to water and allowed to sit there with nothing else happening to it. And I think one of the most egregious wrongs that happened during this time was not just their inability to recognize the failings or the problems that could occur from storing ash in that way, but that these were in unlined ponds. In fact, the lining of the bottom of these ponds was made by the coal ash itself, which was impacted down over years and years. Well, everyone knew that this was a problem, but nobody was ready to fix it because it would have cost tens of millions of dollars. And so the effect of that was on December 22nd, 2008, the largest industrial spill in the history of the United States occurred. And this is what the effects look like. Over 1 billion, with a B, gallons of coal ash dumped into the Emery River, pushing houses off of their foundations and devastating the entire environmental area. This was larger than the Exxon Valdez and Deepwater Horizon spills combined, and it was 10 times larger than the Exxon Valdez spill. It was no small thing, and if you're from this region, it was also no small news. We find it interesting that around the country, a lot of people don't seem to know about this situation. And so because of that, I wanted to make sure and show a little bit of this.
We burn so much coal in this country for electricity that every year that process generates, listen to this number, 130 million tons of waste. Most of it is coal ash, and it contains some nasty stuff. Environmental scientists tell us that concentrations of mercury, arsenic, lead, and other toxic metals are considerably higher in coal ash than in ordinary soil. When coal ash is disposed of in dry, lined impoundments, it's said to be safe. But as we first reported last October, it's often dumped into wet ponds. There are over 500 of them across the country, and in those cases, the ash can pose health risks to nearby communities.
The story will continue in a moment.
We got about 48.
I'm not going to play the rest of the video, but suffice it to say that the story received immense national press in the years following. But most of that press was around the idea that, this substance had been dumped into the surrounding environment. Local homeowners were affected because of their property and the property values there was a large case that was litigated during those ensuing years for around 2 to 3 years after that fact. And that case did, in fact, lead to a successful result for the homeowners surrounding it. But during this entire time, there were hundreds, almost 1,000 different East Tennesseans who were working to clean up this spill. And during that time, they were not provided with any personal protective equipment, such as dust mask, respirator, Tyvek suits, but not even any kind of skin protection. They were provided a hard hat and an orange vest. We have known for years what the constituent toxins of coal ash were, and it is almost inexcusable. It is inexcusable that they were not provided the proper protective equipment. And what happens when that kind of thing occurs, as you'll see, is what has become an occupational disaster that was completely avoidable. One of the most insidious parts about coal ash isn't just the toxins that you just read on the screen. Of course, there's arsenic at higher levels than in background soil. We're also going to talk about the radioactivity of coal ash. But a lot of it is the fact that when dried and not contained in a slurry pond, it has a propensity to become airborne. And a lot of that is due to the fact that it is small particle size. And coal ash is dangerous irrespective of its chemical composition. And as you can see here during the cleanup, there's dust that has become airborne as a result of the work that's being done in churning up the coal ash. This is a real problem because coal ash is made of a large percentage of what we call fine particulate matter. Now, fine particulate matter is often called PM 2.5, which means it's 2.5 microns in diameter, which is much, much smaller than a grain of table salt. And then you have also even smaller particles. But anything less than that we would consider what's called respirable, meaning it can go into your lung tissue and embed itself there. And we have our physician and a PhD with us who'll talk more about those topics. But what we know is that irrespective of these other constituent toxins contained in coal ash, it is harmful to human health just because it's small in size. And so we know at the site that people were breathing this in, that it was embedded into their lungs, and that we saw numerous different people with upper respiratory issues, COPD, and often leading to other issues, cardiovascular issues. And then you add to that the fact that it also contains toxic constituents, then you have a real serious problem. This is something that went unregulated and was just allowed to occur without any personal protective equipment from these workers. We've known, in fact, that fine particulate matter has been an issue since the 1970s. In fact, there was, from a team at Harvard, a study called the 6 Cities Study, in which they studied populations around 6 cities that were in close proximity to coal-fired power plants. And the findings from that study was that if you were living in those areas, that you had a much higher propensity for getting certain cardiovascular conditions, and one was associated with the other. And we've known that since back when one of the preeminent books, Particles in Our Air, was published back in the 1980s. Of course, this is what led to the regulations on coal stacks, and we put scrubbers on those so that the coal isn't put, fine particulates aren't just shot into the atmosphere anymore. Now we just collect them and put them into slurry ponds. Well, we've seen what happens when you don't actually store them correctly. It's a problem that's not going away. You take one problem and you create another one with it. And that's what occurred at Kingston. I think what's the emerging, almost most dangerous aspect and most difficult to wrap your head around is the fact that coal ash is also radioactive. It contains, and Dr. Kleiman will talk about this, radium-226 and other radioactive isotopes. That one might be the most problematic for us at the moment, but he will give you a very detailed rundown of exactly why that is. But it's now becoming clear that coal ash contains alpha emitting particles and gamma emitting particles. And the fact is that coal ash is, during the Kingston spill, was not regulated, or at least safety was not properly considered. But also now, coal ash is being used as filler for cinder blocks, for roadways, for playgrounds, for golf courses. And we are beginning to understand that gamma radiation that is emitted from coal ash is causing serious health concerns. There has been a new EPA study that's come out. Dr. Kleiman will talk to you about that. But this is going to be, in the years that are coming, the big issue surrounding coal ash. We need to do something about these open air slurry ponds. That coal ash has to go somewhere. We need to line them. We need to do something with them so that this doesn't happen again. But this is going to also be an issue because of the leaching into local water supplies. And the fact is, these coal companies are selling this as if it's a product to be used as filler. They're making money off of a toxic substance, a radioactive substance. So just to talk a little bit about the remediation itself, I wanted to give a brief overview of why coal ash deserves this kind of consideration. But knowing that, I'm a litigator, and I've litigated as lead counsel on the case, representing over, at the time, 250 of the workers who helped to clean up the spill. And there were over 900, but there were around 250 who actually filed lawsuits. These lawsuits over time were consolidated into a big mass tort, which was essentially a grouping of a lot of personal injury cases. I can't tell you the difficulty in proving medical causation for that many different people, given their medical histories, their particular exposures to coal ash at the site. But I want to talk about what happened at the site, and I think that the reason we were successful and was the theme of this year's conference is cultivating community. It was that a community of people were sickened and banded together, and their cohesion was where their strength lied. And because of that, and because we were able to work together with them as a community of people, of the workers themselves, of lawyers, and of experts and physicians, we were actually able to successfully resolve this case. This is something we hope that we're able to instill in everyone and can promote as a guide of how we can move forward in this type of litigation on these huge cases that almost seem impossible at the beginning. So the remediation process involved, as you can see, these huge, backhoes and so forth. I mean, just imagine how difficult it is getting this amount of 1 billion gallons of coal ash out of a river. There was also an issue involving what we call legacy materials that were at the bottom of the river, because this is actually downriver from, if you've ever heard of the Oak Ridge nuclear facilities. There had been issues about that in the past, back in the 1980s, that had been, deposited at the bottom of that river. So it added an extra layer of complication to the cleanup process. But, this was just a massive, massive undertaking. And I think what is, and this was an undertaking that was, of course, taken on by TVA. They did cause the spill. But also an important player here was Jacobs Engineering, now called Jacobs Solutions. They were the general contractor hired by TVA to assist in the cleanup. Jacobs, if you don't know, is one of the largest engineering firms in the world. And they have the expertise and at times have done some good work in what they have done building, but at other times they have failed. And in one example is the Kingston cleanup, where Jacobs took on the role of safety oversight and utterly failed in that task. So, Jacobs had safety managers, we call them industrial hygienists and so forth, on site to help oversee the safety of workers. And they did, in fact, put together programs that they would claim showed that there were not high enough levels of any constituent toxins of coal ash at the site to cause, dangers to human health. OSHA has certain standards, we call them permissible exposure limits, and the fact is that Jacobs and their safety overseers put together programs which, in fact, they would have workers wear personal air monitors that would, they say, measure the amounts of certain types of constituent toxins, and that they found through this program no exceedances of any of the daily permissible exposure limits. This was, in fact, the key defense that they made throughout the entire case. Jacobs, by the way, was the defendant that was pursued in the case because at the time TVA was assumed to be immune from suit due to their governmental status. And so if you're familiar with sovereign immunity, that was assumed the TVA was immune. But Jacobs was not, and they were pursued. But they did claim during that time that they should be entitled to derivative governmental immunity. I don't want to get too far into the legal weeds on that, but in fact we were successful in proving that they weren't. But during the time that they were running their safety program, they were measuring for certain toxins. I'll tell you what they were not measuring for, though. Any exposure, to fine particulate matter, and how do you measure for that? The only thing that they did was essentially take daily personal air monitoring and attempt to show that there were no exceedances of things like arsenic. Now, the thing is, the EPA nor OSHA have any permissible exposure limits for the substance we know as coal ash. And at this time, there was no science to support that coal ash was even dangerous to human health. But it was like trying to prove water is wet. Obviously it is. But the fact is, they took the position that, look, coal ash does not contain any more than what is usually found in background soil. And so the argument on their part was, and could be argued or stated that coal ash is no more dangerous than dirt. And that was something that was stated over and over again. Well, I mean, workers were denied even the most basic personal protective equipment. And in fact, they were threatened and some fired because they attempted to wear masks or respirators on this site. You've seen the pictures of the dust in the air, and we'll talk to you about what happened in terms of the medical conditions that arose among this cohort. But the fact that they were denied even the simplest of protections is stunning. So, you see here again the dust that is churned up. I mean, this is just clear evidence that they every day had this big issue of particulate matter, exposures to respirable materials, toxic materials, and this is another indicative example. This is one of the break areas, and this is actually within what we call the exclusion zone. And people were working, by the way, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, nearly every day, every year, for close to 5 years. I mean, this was, and they were being paid for what this area is good money. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. You said like their justification for denying the safety equipment was it's no more dangerous than dirt. Did they even have a justification for affirmatively like having consequences for a worker that brought their own equipment with them?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and we're going to have questions at the end too, but I'll go ahead and answer yours at the moment. So there were a few things that were said, and there's a lot of obfuscation that happens among something this big. But I could say that mainly the point was made at the time that, number one, coal ash is not dangerous. And number two, we're testing it, and there are no levels of dangerous toxins that we're seeing in our testing that would justify the need for masks. Number three, masks are not needed because in some instances, because of the heat of the day, that we don't want people to be subjected to those kinds of things. And you can name any number of different kinds of arguments that will continue. And there's no, the only thing that they can really try to disprove this is look at the evidence in front of your face. We had workers who were exposed to these clear dust clouds. We had workers who every day were covered in coal ash, and they could smell it, they could taste it. I mean, these are key signals that they're being exposed to toxic substances. One of the big issues or problems that we saw in litigating the cases, we had no quantifiable data to show that anyone was exposed to it at any certain level. We had to find a different way around that problem. Well, the way you do that is look at the anecdotal evidence, look at the circumstantial evidence. We have people hundreds, who could testify that they saw coal ash on their skin, that they blew it out of their nostrils, that they tasted it. These are the ways that you can, in the face of what we believe was non-credible, inaccurate data that was being collected by the safety program, and that you're able to rebut that. I wanted to point out this is, kind of a funny anecdote that we have, that this is the break area. This is the only area that people could, find some exit from the exclusion zone during the time they were working. This is just a pitiful example of the only thing that they had to wash off the coal ash that was on their body was this pan here. And there were a few of these around the site. We call this a boot wash, but essentially they would brush off the coal ash. There's coolers here with, we assume would have been water or whatever. And we call this the magic orange fence that magically protected them from the coal ash that was surrounding. But as you can see, workers were covered in this stuff, and it would have been impossible not to be. With this much coal ash being dried in the sun, becoming airborne, and frankly, just how do you get that stuff out of the environment, which is an important task, by the way. And there's stuff to be proud of from these workers. There's a lot to be mad about. There's a lot to be sad about. There's a lot to be proud of. These people believed in what they were doing and wanted to help their community. I can tell you about, three brothers called the Bledsoe brothers, who are among East Tennessee's finest people. And one of them died of lung and brain cancer a few years back. But when they'd all worked in the movie industry. And I was mentioning before that one of them, Ron Bledsoe, was the stunt double for Chris Christopherson for many years. These guys had careers outside of working in the, cleaning up coal ash or in, this kind of roughneck scenario. They dropped everything they were doing to go clean this up because they believe so much in we need to protect our community. We need to clean up this environment. And that you could see people, they absolutely got, right in there and cleaned everything up. I mean, people were covered with coal ash. One of the most illustrative points of this, the absurdity of the position that Jacobs took was this is a stipulated point. It's a fact that is not disputed. In fact, we went to trial on general causation in the case, but workers were told on a near daily basis in group meetings that you can eat a pound of coal ash every day and it will not harm you.
Why were they cleaning it up?
Exactly. The question is, why were they cleaning it up? Exactly right. The cognitive dissonance is clear. But I would submit that the work that was being done, the equipment that was provided to the workers, was for public perception, was not for worker safety. And in fact, we have evidence that was found through discovery processes during the litigation that showed that a lot of the points were made among Jacobs and TVA's internal safety personnel, that this was not to be spoken of as a decontamination, that this is about public perception. And I would submit to you that when this bill occurred, it was something akin to an existential crisis for TVA. And frankly, they needed to do something because this site I may not have mentioned, the Kingston fossil plant, is within plain view of one of the busiest interstates in the entire country, Interstate 40. And every day, thousands and thousands of people were looking at exactly what was happening. And they did not want them to be looking at people wearing dust masks and Tyvek suits cleaning this up. Because what then is the community being exposed to? And what would the community ask of TVA if they believed that their children were being exposed to these substances? So the workers were treated, as has been said in a lot of media, as expendables. And I believe that. And there were dozens of people who I truly believe died as a direct result of the coal ash exposures that they had at the site. But according to Mr. Tom Bach, you can eat a pound of it a day and still be safe. It's absurd.
Did you ask him how many pounds he ate?
That's funny. I mean, and there was a trial, and these transcripts are public record. They're available for review by anyone in the media or anyone here who wants to look at them. Tom Bach was there, and he did not deny saying that. I didn't bring it with me but I have a mason jar that sits on my desk as a reminder of what I work for every day, and it has a pound of coal ash in it that a worker had collected there and gave to me. And I look at it every day and say that this reminds me of something I'm working.
It's pretty tasty.
And I would sprinkle it on my cereal in the morning. I didn't bring it on the airplane. I didn't want it to be confiscated. But this is the extent of what they do.
After the rain dries up a little bit, I've been here with the science with that, I can't go. Will I be like signing on that form to wear a mask out here?
I don't think it's the ash, because I've got the same allergy problems that I've never had before, and I talked to my doctor, and it's not the ash, it's the pollen this year, it's horrible. It's the pollen. Give it a couple more weeks, take an Allegra or two, it's the pollen. The pollen is horrific this year. You and I have been on this for how many years? And it's never affected us. It's the pollen this year because this temperature variant. So the trees are going pollen, no pollen, pollen, no pollen. So we're kind of getting a longer spray of it. This rain actually helped wash it all off. So give it a couple more days, about a week. Trust me, it's not the ash.
That was one of Jacobs Engineering's industrial hygienists on site. Those were the kinds of things told to workers on an individual basis. And this was Mike McCarthy, who was one of the plaintiffs, asking if he could wear a mask and basically being told, no, you can't. He filmed it because he knew what everyone else knew, which was that they were being exposed to dangerous substances. And some might ask, why would they continue to expose themselves to these kinds of things? Well, a lot of folks from this area are not high on the socioeconomic scale, and they were paying big dollars to work at the site. And a lot of people were making more money than they'd ever made in their life. And I don't fault them for going and cleaning up this disaster, which needed, human efforts to do, but they deserve better protection. There's also the fact that, and I would never say that Jacobs or TVA purposefully tried to manipulate their data, even though that there's a possibility that the safety programs they put together to test for constituent toxins were actually probably faulty in numerous ways, and the experts that we had stated as much. But many times, and this is one example of that, their practices were inadequate and often just inappropriate.
Well, let's see here. Any other observations or concerns right now? There you go. Not much. Not too much at all.
So that's a personal air monitor that sucks in air and is designed to test for the concentrations of when sent off for analysis, the concentrations, certain constituent toxins. It is absolutely not a proper procedure to dump out what is within one of those and then tell the worker that, see, there's nothing in it, when the worker's standing there with coal ash all over their skin and face. And there's any number of people who would tell you that happened to them. It happened over and over again. This was just the time it was filmed. I say this often, but this was the largest industrial spill in the history of the United States. It's one of, if not the largest environmental disaster in the history of the United States, period. But Jacobs and its failings, TVA and its failings, allowed an environmental disaster to become an unnecessary occupational disaster. And it was as avoidable as it was catastrophic and tragic. Now, I'm going to leave a lot of the rest about the occupational injuries that occurred for Dr. Hind and Dr. Kleiman to speak to, but just note that there were numerous injuries that we saw among the cohort, and this is what prompted the filing of the personal injury lawsuits. These began to be filed around 2013, and during the first year or so, there were around 50 or more of these people that were brave enough, band together to file these claims against their then employers. And then over the ensuing years, hundreds of more joined. This is, again, a conference about community and cultivating that community. We could not have done this without the community uprising and people standing up to power. The fact is that when people started to get sick, people's family members started to die. And I've been to more funerals than I care to tell you. That the community backing us up on this is what put this into the public view, and it stayed there for years. And thankfully, that's the kind of pressure that we can put on this defendant and to get to the result we did. There was a federal lawsuit that was filed in 2013. As I said, eventually that was consolidated, and the court bifurcated the issues in the case, which is a kind of a gift to a defendant in certain situations, but basically said that there will need to be a trial on the issue of whether Jacobs breached a duty to the workers and whether coal ash is capable of causing certain diseases. And so there was this trial, and the plaintiffs were victorious in proving that indeed Jacobs had a duty to protect worker safety on site. They undertook that duty and they breached that duty. Through all of the evidence I've shown you and much more, all available in trial transcripts, it's public record, and a jury found that not only that they breached that duty, also that coal ash was capable of causing a list of 10 different medical conditions. These were just the ones that were present among those workers at the time. There were certain strategic choices made by the plaintiff's counsel at that time to only limit it. These are not the only things that coal ash cause, but we believe that they do, in fact, cause these things. And this is a list of the different medical conditions. Among them, leukemia, lung cancer, coronary artery disease, peripheral neuropathy, and COPD. Various other conditions we're sure that coal ash is certainly capable of causing, but this is what the jury found. I want to speak briefly, and I won't go on but for a couple more minutes, and then hand off to Dr. Hind. But proving specific causation is quite different than proving general causation. In order to prove specific causation, you have to look on a plaintiff-specific basis. Was this actual plaintiff exposed to levels of some constituent toxin capable of causing an injury that you're claiming for that person? And to do that, you have to have an elemental approach, because court systems require that you, number one, show that the substance itself is dangerous and capable of causing injury, and then second, that the person has been exposed to a level of that toxin that was capable of causing that person an injury. And so the second part is extremely difficult to do, particularly in the face of what Jacobs or the defendant would be claiming is quantifiable evidence to the contrary, showing no exceedances of permissible exposure limits or otherwise. Well, how did we do that? Well, we used what was a copious amount of individual knowledge, which translated into testimonial evidence. And during a 3-month span in 2020, which if you recall, a little thing called the COVID pandemic was happening, we had over 250 depositions during a 3-month span. This was an all hands on deck, 15 lawyers working day and night to make this happen. And when we talk about community, there's a community of lawyers who really care and banded together to make that happen. And through those that deposition process, which was demanded by the defense, and we called them on that and had them do it, we were able to establish in the record that people daily were seeing coal ash on their skin, that they were smelling it every day, that they were tasting it every day. These pieces of anecdotal evidence, when grouped together as a whole, is enough to establish that there was, or at least put in the hands of a proper expert, that there was circumstantial evidence of exposure, despite the quantifiable data that the defense was showing, which of course we showed that was not credible based on the ways that they were operating. But essentially what we did during that also 2020 time period, and this was during a few months after myself and my law firm at the time, Milberg Kleiman, was brought in as lead counsel. We assembled a team of elite environmental and scientific experts, which was the absolute necessity that brought this case to a victory. And we're going to talk about the process of how we put that together. But also that happened during that time was motion and appellate practice. We successfully argued numerous motions before the district court, dispositive motions to dismiss. We're able to fight off all of these motions over a many-year period. We appeared before the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals on the issue of Jacobs' claim to derivative governmental immunity, which they were claiming essentially that TVA, because they're entitled to immunity as a governmental entity, that Jacobs should also be entitled to immunity, derivative of TVA's immunity. Well, what happened during that time period was actually the United States Supreme Court had ruled that TVA was no longer entitled to automatic governmental immunity when they're engaged in commercial activities. And even when they're engaged in governmental functions, they're not entitled to immunity if the lawsuit does not amount to a grave interference with that governmental function. Well, we took the approach of saying TVA never was entitled to immunity in the first place. The court agreed with us and now has opened TVA up to expose them now to a massive amount of liability, which that's one of the great legal victories that we won in the case. This is standing outside the Supreme Court, of the Tennessee Supreme Court, after one of our arguments that we had. And, I just wanted to, speak to the idea of community. These people drove hours to get to, this was in Nashville, Tennessee. And, during that time, there was also a woman, I would be remiss if I didn't mention her name, is Fran Ansley. She was a law professor at the University of Tennessee Law School for many years, but environmental and human advocate. She passed away last month, and she's dearly, dearly missed. I'd like to play just a minute of this, but this speaks to how the community banded together and what we were able to do.
I'm so glad to see these faces around us. I'm thinking about some of the coal ash families who have already driven to Nashville tonight because they want to go and be and hear what happens in the courtroom tomorrow. It's been so wrong and also so long and also so wrong in my heart. Because Jacobs Engineering, which is the defendant in this case, they're the contractor, the general contractor that TVA hired to run this job. They're the ones who promised the TVA to keep things safe. Jacobs keeps losing specific battles in this case, but they are winning a war for delay. And we're getting close to 60 people who have died since the cleanup itself. The Phase 1 jury, after hearing all the evidence and hearing from experts in occupational disease, decided 3 crucial points. 1, Jacobs broke its promises to TVA that it was going to run a safe job. 2, Jacobs failed to exercise what we call reasonable care for safety at TVA. This is a duty it owed directly to the men and women working on that job site. The third thing the jury decided in the plaintiff's favor was that coal ash is indeed capable of causing the specific injuries that Kingston workers were complaining about in this lawsuit.
And I know that a lot of
I'm so glad to see these faces around us.
A lot of East Tennessee lawyers are very saddened by the loss of Fran Ansley. She was one of the great advocates for environmental advocates and advocates of injured people and great causes. That was her speaking. And that shows you, that was actually filmed in Knoxville, Tennessee, around the Market Square area, and it shows you how much the community had really, banded together against, what was a David versus Goliath kind of fight. I just spoke to you about the proving specific causation. In order to do that, we've had to prove different elements. I'm gonna let Dr. Hind speak to how we were able to do it, but the long and short of it is this: we had to put together an expert team that we believe would be able to make or allowed to make certain inferential leaps in proving medical causation. You've got to show that coal ash is dangerous. You've got to show that from an epidemiological perspective. You have to show that workers were exposed to levels of the toxin capable of causing your injury from an industrial hygiene perspective. You have to show that it has a plausibility of actually causing that injury, the exposure to the dangerous toxin, from a toxicological perspective. Dr. Kleiman can speak to that. And then you have to take that, those generally applicable pieces of evidence, put it in the hands of a clinician who can then say, from what we call a differential etiology approach, exclude other risk factors for their conditions, and then be able to say, more likely than not, that coal ash exposure was a substantial contributing factor to this person's specific disease. That is an enormous undertaking. And in order to do it, we put together what, again, we believe is one of the most qualified and high caliber expert teams that's ever been assembled in one of these cases. I'm going to let Angela speak to that, but the last thing I'll point out is that Dr. Ward, who wanted to be here with us, but was an epidemiologist from the World Trade Center Science Advisory Committee. What we began doing, and I think is a great testament to the creativity of the lawyers who put together our expert team in the case with the assistance of Dr. Hind, was that there was no coal ash expert that we could go to in a case like this. It doesn't exist. We didn't have massive amounts of peer-reviewed literature that we could wave around to the court saying that coal ash is dangerous, it causes these problems. We had to build a team of experts from different fields whose work in concert could establish all of these different elements. And we had to, what we believe was the aha moment of the case, was analogized to a different exposure event. And we decided that what is the closest thing to this coal ash cleanup, and it was the World Trade Center cleanup. And it was an exposure to the byproducts of hydrocarbon combustion and a microcosm of what was one of the greatest American tragedies, the World Trade Center, but a microcosm of the type of workplace exposures that occurred. And we began approaching the experts who had supported the causation for World Trade Center cleanup workers, and many of them were very receptive and joined our team. And we went to the clinicians who treated those people, and they joined our team. And it's a list of some of the very top people in their field. And I'm going to just say that Angela will speak more to it, but you have to, in a case like this, come into it with so much energy and focus, because we were up against odds that were just incredible. But I give a lot of credit to the attorneys I worked with, in particular a man named Greg Kleiman, who was brave enough to allow me and others to use the resources of the law firm at the time to build this expert team, which cost money and cost time. And I told you about the dozen or more lawyers who spent their time taking the depositions, sitting through, defending the depositions, preparing witnesses for depositions. But that it was collaboration between all of those lawyers, our expert team, and then the community. And again, I think really ties in with the theme of this year's conference, which is cultivating community. It was that led to a successful result. And with that, I want to pass the microphone to Dr. Angela.
Well, we're going to give you a big round of applause first.
Well, Billy really is amazing, as you can tell. It's been such an incredible journey working with him. and all the lawyers involved. So I'm a physician, the little fish out of water here to say the least. But I practiced internal medicine for 17 years, and it's a great thing to do. But in the last 10 years, I only work with lawyers, and really it's because lawyers just get so much done in terms of pushing like societal health forward and affecting radical change. So it's one sector of society where we can still just affect change in huge ways. But it takes people coming together. And so that's why I'm here today. And want to just talk to you a little bit. Billy talked to you about the case through the lens of like the legal system. I'm going to talk to you about the case through the lens of human health. So let me see, Billy. Here we go. So when we think about these cases from the perspective of human health, I think the Kingston case is demonstrative of three big truths that we're seeing in communities all across the country where toxic contamination is affecting health. Number one, toxin exposures matter to health. You know, at some point our society is going to have to understand that, believe it, make it a priority. Number two, there is very little recourse in our system for people whose health has been injured from corporate recklessness and toxic contamination. I would say very little is an overestimate. I would say really none. Maybe for workers in a few pockets there's silica, asbestos, but generally there is no recourse. And number three, when we form community, and this talk is particularly focusing on when doctors, lawyers, scientists come together, incredible things happen. I've seen this with PFAS, I've seen it with pesticides, and now with this case. And this is the way forward when we're thinking about toxic contamination in human health. Obviously, policymaking and nonprofits and they do all incredible things. I'm just talking about in terms of like affecting radical change for specific people who are harmed. So this is a quote about community. We all tried to come back to this focus of community since the conference was interested in that, and it really gave us all a chance to think about community. In this case, it was actually a powerful exercise. But this guy, Larry Harvey, he's the Burning Man guy. I don't know a lot about Burning Man, but I know enough to know that he kind of dedicated his whole life to thinking about community, which I think is an interesting thing to dedicate your life to. This quote is just one of my favorites. It's about, you know, why community forms, and there are a lot of reasons, obviously, but we're really reckless with our environment. We're reckless with our health. Corporations are reckless with both. So what do we do about that? And we're at this weird time in history where, because we're reckless with our environment and human health as well, doctors and lawyers are kind of in the same boat. We're in this shared struggle of what in the world? You know, we've kind of wrecked our environment. Now we've wrecked our health as a result. So this talk is a little bit of a plea saying we are in this shared struggle. How can we come together to really push back against not just corporate recklessness, but you know, just the whole disregard for human health generally and for the environment. I want to go to one. Oh, I don't know where that. Well, I'm missing one slide, but the slide is about, you know, our health is completely a reflection of our environment. We've always known that, but now we know it in a big, big way. And the reason we know it is because we've been contaminating our environment for decades with toxins. And, you know, we kind of let that go, or it's just, oh, that's the environment, oh, those are endangered species. You know, the bigger world was, you know, kind of cared about that to some extent. But now what we're seeing is it is affecting human health. So we have this health crisis now. We have an incredibly unprecedented epidemic of chronic illness in our country. The slide that's not there is 1 in 3 of us will get cancer in our lifetime. We have about 1 in 6 children who are neurodevelopmentally affected in ways we've never seen before. Those are huge numbers. And then, of course, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease, all the kind of chronic illnesses we hear about. About 1 in 6 of us have those as well. So those are unprecedented numbers, and we know that What we've done to the environment over the last 6 to 7 decades has now finally been reflected in our health. So it's kind of a huge wake-up call. So again, a plea for doctors, lawyers, environmental lawyers in particular, and scientists to come together. You know, we're all advocates. We have so much in common, and now we have this shared struggle in common as well. So, case in point, and when we're talking about recklessness with the environment and recklessness with human health, as Billy has outlined in detail, I won't go through much of that again. But what I do want to talk about is the toxin exposures of the workers because of the coal ash and what's in it. So this is what was in predominantly in the coal ash at Kingston. All coal ash is a little different, but these were the things we were looking at that were most prominent in the coal ash the workers were exposed to. There were about 900 workers, as Billy said, we represented about 250, in the end 221, you know, some plaintiffs drop off for various reasons. So when we think about this toxin exposure, like if we were exposed to just one of these, that would be a health insult. That would be significant to our health. Whether we were exposed to it in a large dose or whether just in a small dose over time, we would know that would be significant. Whether that was lead, arsenic, cadmium. But these workers were exposed to all of those concomitantly and over time. And just quickly, the data with our workers, I think the data turned out to be very compelling. We reviewed the medical records of all 221 plaintiffs. We knew everything about their medical history, read every page of everybody's medical record. And we spoke to them by phone. I did clinical interviews for all these 221 people, so we knew a lot about these people's medical history and their psychological state, just who they were. We knew who they were at all levels or at multiple levels. So hematologic malignancies led the case in terms of severity of disease, right? We had, there were 7 people with leukemia, 5 with acute leukemia. Those were some of the most tragic cases. 2 of them died from the leukemia. Overall, 32 people died just from illnesses that we knew were related to their exposure. In terms of other conditions that Billy mentioned that the jury found would be, are related to their coal ash exposure, coronary artery disease, about 25% of the plaintiffs developed coronary artery disease, and this was coronary artery disease where they needed a stent. They needed a coronary artery bypass grafting. This was significant. We only included people who had documented coronary artery disease or documented COPD and asthma for which they needed treatment or lifelong medications. Lung diseases, about 50% developed COPD and or asthma. These were not all smokers. That was one of the more horrifying part of it all, and even it's horrifying for smokers. But the fact was plenty of these people were young, they didn't smoke, and they developed COPD or work-related asthma very quickly. Really, they developed it on site, and it never went away after they left the site. They're committed to lifelong medications and treatment. That's a huge number, obviously. And then we had this kind of these other illnesses that maybe aren't as serious, but really when we think about the numbers, they're just as compelling. So chronic upper respiratory illnesses. So this, that video you saw where he said, "Oh, it's just the pollen." The workers really, the only person, there were 2 people who didn't complain of respiratory, who, like, when I talked to him on the phone, said, "No, I didn't really notice any respiratory symptoms." And the 2, I kept saying, "Really? Are you sure? Do you remember?" Because literally had become such the norm. They were very young people, the people who tended not to be affected by any of these illnesses. And like I said, there were probably 2 or 3. They were young. They were 18 to 19 when they started. They worked there a couple of years, and then they just moved on, and they were fine. Everyone else was affected by something or another. So chronic upper respiratory illness means while I was on site, I developed sinus symptoms, whether that's runny nose, cough, going to the doctor with sinusitis, and then it never went away. I was never the same from an upper respiratory standpoint since that time. And then peripheral neuropathies, we had people who, this was thought to be from the lead. We had people who developed significant neuropathy to the point where, they needed an EMG, a diagnostic study. They needed lifelong medications. They were disabled. A couple of them had to quit their job. It was so severe. All the way to people who needed lifelong kind of symptomatic medications because they just had these kind of non-specific sensory symptoms develop. And they were so consistent. My hands and feet go numb. They hurt all the time. It was very consistent with a peripheral neuropathy. It couldn't always be diagnosed with our kind of large nerve fiber diagnostic entities, but they had symptoms that were so consistent with neuropathy that they were on medications. And again, this was thought to be from the lead. And the last thing I want to talk about is erectile dysfunction. We did not pursue that in the court of law as a claimed condition for a lot of different reasons legally, but every 221 people, if you asked them if they have erectile dysfunction, if they didn't know what that was, you explained it to them. 72% said yes. I've never been able to have sex again, ever. This is an unbelievable number. Of all the things that came out in those interviews, this really stuck with me the most. I thought, wow, that is really life impacting and life impairing. These are not particularly, some of them are older, if that even matters, but it does. Some of them were older, 55 and up, but most of them were in their 30s and 40s. What do they even do with that? No one would tell them what it's from or what happened, but in the end, they had all just accepted that. Luckily, they talked to each other about that a lot, and I think that became a source of solace. But those are incredible numbers. So the other thing we saw in this group that are just kind of more non-specific symptoms, and we've talked a lot about the reasons for these a lot, but when we have a big body burden of toxins, you do get a lot of non-specific symptoms that we really don't know what to do with and what exactly the mechanism of action is. And some of it might be a psychic overlay from the trauma of being exposed and knowing you are exposed and your health is impacted forever. That's incredibly psychologically traumatic. But we saw a lot of fatigue, depression, brain fog. Certainly 99%. Only that one person who said, I was fine. he was this young guy, I was fine. But everyone else said, no, I would never do that again. I wouldn't pay $1 million. I mean, we probably have 50 quotes saying, no, to the same thing. I would never do that. It ruined my health forever, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one of my favorite quotes from a Kingston plaintiff. There are 3 of them, but the top one I want to talk about. So one thing that we heard over and over during these clinical interviews, and Billy heard it when he was doing his legal thing with the plaintiffs, is we were all having symptoms on the site, whether it was sinus symptoms, whether it was cardiac symptoms, they developed all these kinds of symptoms. And then for the few years after that, they started to develop diseases, outright diseases. We knew we were sick. Everyone was getting sick. And there was absolutely no place to turn. They went to their doctors, and the doctors, as you saw in there, said, it's the pollen, or it's, I have no idea. Over and over, they went to their medical doctors, who knew nothing about toxin exposures in health, and certainly none of them validated that it might be this fly ash or coal ash exposure that was contributing to their symptoms. And they had no, there was no we'll talk about this in a minute, but there were no public entities that really help people who were exposed to toxins and their health is affected. And that's where the community came in. They started turning to each other, right? That was the only place they had to turn, was to each other. Ultimately, they turned to Billy, and this is the crux of this talk too. These people in communities across the country who are being exposed to toxic contamination in a way that's harming their health, their only recourse is lawyers right now. That is just true. In the immediate, with regards to their health harm. Again, I want to still call out policy, people, grassroots organizations and nonprofits who work for policy change, incredibly important. But if your health is harmed or your community's health is harmed, environmental lawyers, they are really one of the only places people have to turn to get any answers or recourse. And these are the agencies. So we talked about the medical system we are not trained in toxin exposure, especially chronic toxin exposure in health. We're not that interested. As recent as 20 years ago, it was really scoffed at in the medical field. Like, honestly, if you were a doctor it was like you were kind of if a patient was worried about they were kind of neurotic or kind of a weenie, that happens in the medical field all the time, right? We label patients as a certain way as an excuse for things that we don't know how to handle. So the medical system has been very dismissive of toxins in health. Getting better, maybe, but not in treating them or diagnosing them, just that they can no longer deny that toxins are a huge, are playing a huge role in our health right now. So the EPA, we all know that, does great things, but they tend to lag a little bit behind science, and so that can't always help human health injury. And then local health departments, whether it's PFAS, whether it's coal ash, it's not the place to turn. They just don't know about toxins and health and injury of their constituents. So this is what recourse looks like. This is what we're talking about today. These are our. This was our panel of experts. I think when the defense is very reckless with the way they can blatantly and seemingly accurately say that toxin exposure didn't cause your health injury. What are you talking about? There's no evidence to that. And this is why, right? They can speak so articulately. And so in order to combat that, because there often is no quantifiable data, there often is no single causation. One toxin does not cause one disease. One toxin can cause a multitude of diseases. Multiple toxins can cause one disease. Like, it's such an abyss that really one of the most powerful ways to combat that in society and in court is to just put together this tidal wave of expertise so that no matter what the defense brings in terms of their arguments and no matter what the court is thinking about, there is someone there or everyone there who can articulate what the answer is and why, when we critically think based on our expertise, this is the only rational conclusion we can come to. So these, I want to talk about like how you get a group of these people together, and it's not about like, oh, let's go to the best universities and find the best. It's some of that, but there are thousands of incredible scientists, doctors, researchers out there who are incredible advocates, honestly, and who are disillusioned in their own fields, because the medical field and even the scientific researching field is, there's a lot going wrong in those sectors right now, and advocacy is harder and harder to do in those sectors. So there's so many committed doctors and scientists out there. So how do you find them, or how do you connect with them? First of all, I would say the most important thing is to clarify your mission in the case. These cases, doctors, scientists, all of us, people don't care, all of us don't care, advocates don't care about money so much. It's really about meaning and purpose and seeing the future and what is this doing to move things forward in a bigger way. So these are some of the things Billy and I and ultimately our whole team, talked about over and over and over. This is what we always came back to, like chemical contamination threatens our very existence, and we need advocates to come together. Like, we are all here to come together to try to push back on this blatant disregard for our health. So this was our mission. This is a mission that we've applied to other cases, parts of it, and I think it's crucial when you're thinking about forming an expert team and communicating your mission, because you're really enrolling an expert team in your mission. We're all in this together around this mission, around this shared struggle. So when you start thinking about expert teams, first of all, think really big. And I'm not saying just think of the top universities, that's important, but you're going to think big in terms of, I just need to cover a lot of bases, whatever your contamination and health injury is. An epidemiologist that can really help me outline the data, for that toxin exposure and health injury. Basic science researchers, physicians. I think Billy mentioned this. The reason physicians are so important is they have clinical experience that is very valuable in the court of law. If someone's had 30 years of seeing people with this disease and thinking about differential diagnosis and what does cause this particular disease, you know, they can totally read the science, even if they don't know about it yet. They can read the science and understand that absolutely this person's heart disease or this person's disease could have come from that toxin exposure. So clinical experience is very important. I think occupational medicine physicians, you know, they have really kind of gotten put by the wayside, and they're such a valuable part of our world right now. So really tap into them. They have so much knowledge and clinical experience, both with regards to toxins. And then treating physicians, some of them are very valuable, especially if they're at a university, in a university setting. Some of local treating physicians, it's harder for them. They're speaking in a way that I think is less comfortable for them, and for a lot of different reasons. That's why I kind of put a plus minus. I just want to briefly go through the rest of these. When you think about doing your research to find your experts, I was thinking about Dr. Ward, Liz Ward, and I just want to tell you a funny story. So Billy goes, you know, we're thinking about this World Trade Center analogy because this cocktail of toxins, and like, who was the epidemiologist for the World Trade Center? So you Google, who's the epidemiologist for World Trade Center? And a lot of people pop up. But then it's like, oh, they have this steering committee where a group of epidemiologists have come together to try to figure out what diseases were caused by that disaster, and then who can we compensate, right? So I'm looking at the committee, and I'm like, whoa, well, the chairman is Elizabeth Ward, and then we picked out like her and like 4 other people. And so like, okay, well, how do you contact these people? They are actually very hard to contact because it's kind of a quiet, you know, steering committee. So I'm looking on LinkedIn, and there's Elizabeth Ward, and I thought, okay, I'll just message her. Well, you can't just message people. So I bought this like $1,000 like free trial subscription to LinkedIn where you can message people. And so, and you know, put on my calendar, please cancel that before I get charged. And so I messaged, you know, Dr. Ward with our higher mission. Like, this is our higher mission. This is how we think. This is what we feel. Are you interested in talking? And she wrote back immediately, oh, yeah, that sounds really, you know, fascinating. I'm definitely interested. And I said, okay, well, we can, you know, talk by Zoom. By the way, where do you live? And she said, oh, I live in Asheville. She lives less than a mile from me. She retired to the Asheville. So now we're good friends, and colleagues. But, you know, it's just that kind of creative, how do we connect? How do we make community? That's like one of the highest use of technology, right? Like, figure out how you can get it in front of these people with your mission and see if they're interested. And they may not be. You know, I put in here, expect to be rejected, you know, and reject. I mean, some people just, whatever, that's how community is, right? Some people fit, some people don't. It's nothing personal. It just doesn't matter. If they're interested in the mission, great. If they're not, that's great too. Or if you feel like, you know, they're just not really an advocate or aren't comfortable talking, that's fine too. So, anyway, that's kind of the nuts and bolts. And then just lastly, to sum up, these expert teams have done incredible work. I don't know how many of you are familiar with PFAS. Obviously, it's a big thing now. But we put together expert team for PFAS, kind of in that second wave of litigation, which started in 2014. We literally drove around to universities, met with people, enrolling them in the mission. Same thing. Are you interested in this? Is this something that you know? That I know you do this in your research. Would you be interested in carrying it a step further? That expert team is still. They've been expert for case after case after case. They've gone on to be incredible advocates in society, you know, on panels, working with nonprofits. They've just done it. It's changed their career trajectory forever in a really positive way. They work very closely with lawyers still. So I think it's a beautiful partnership. These are beautiful partnerships that have so much gain for lawyers and doctors and scientists. So, last 2 slides, chemical exposures matter. We have to accept that in this world, that our epidemic of chronic illness is driven by chemical exposures. Granted, processed foods and low nutrient diets, and it's a complex situation, but we know that chemical exposures just might be the primary cause of our current health crisis. So, another plea From a medical standpoint, we have 200 million people or more drinking tap water known to be contaminated with PFAS at levels that can harm their health. The EPA itself says when we get regulations in place in the next 6 to 7 to 10 years, we know this will prevent tens of thousands of serious PFAS attributable illness and death. That's a beautiful thing for the EPA to say. They're so committed to try to get these regulations across the finish line. But in the meantime, we've been letting people drink PFAS since 2014. We knew the levels that were dangerous. Science knew, scientists knew, so we all knew. We knew the levels were dangerous. We've continued. That's been 10 years. They're still drinking levels that are harming health. Same with metropolitan cities and PM 2.5. We know the levels are incredibly high and injuring health. Coal-fired power plants across, particularly the South and Midwest, those communities' health are being injured because of, for a lot of different reasons that Billy talked about, and coal. And then we have the pesticide issue, where we know that children are being exposed to pesticides in some communities at levels that are totally unacceptable when it comes to affecting their health and their health trajectory. You know, our very survival is being threatened by toxic contamination, and we have to figure this out. And I think coming together around this shared struggle makes magic happen, gets things done, and ultimately is the way forward in this moment. This is a coal ash person, so he wiped his, he just wiped his little, with a wipe, and that was his arm. I love this because, the people in the call out, the 221 plaintiffs, their lives, their health, they were never the same. It was so tragic to talk to them. In fact, sometimes Billy and I just had to take a little break because it was just such a tragedy for their families and their health. But this is the case with this is all over the country right now. These are real people, being affected by the fact that they're drinking PFAS and have for the last however many years, or the firefighters, or in cities, PM 2.5, breathing PM 2.5, and have significant asthma and other diseases from PM 2.5 exposure. So we have to remember this is like all of us. This is us. This is our friend. These are our friends, our family, our colleagues. We're all getting sick. No one is. This is the great uniter. So there you go. Thank you all so much. Call me.
And now everyone introduce Dr. Norman Kleiman from Columbia University.
Tell you a little bit about how I got involved in this case. I got a call from Billy. I'd never heard of Kingston Coal Ash spill, like probably most of you had never heard of it before. But the more I learned about it, the more angry I got. And in particular, I got angry at Jacobs and the lack of care, the lack of oversight, the lack of any basic safety standards that were being applied to these workers. My expertise is in radiation exposure. My colleague Joe Graziano in my department is an expert in heavy metals, and together we think we're able to help Billy and help the case and provide some of the scientific background that enabled this case to lead to a successful conclusion. So I'm going to get a little sciencey with you, a little nerdy with you, but talk a little bit about radiation and how this played into this case, and a little bit about radiation in our environment in general. So when we think about radiation, oftentimes we think about nuclear weapons, hazardous material handling, radioactivity, sets off certain alarm bells in our brains. But at the same time, we use nuclear power to generate electricity in this country and around the world. And there is a division among us in our feeling about nuclear power. Some who feel that nuclear power is potentially an existential threat to us, and others who believe that nuclear power is perhaps one of the solutions to the climate crisis we're facing, certainly a better alternative than carbon-based fuels. Unfortunately, there have been a number of major nuclear power disasters over the last 35 years. More than that, starting with 3 Mile Island in this country, then followed by Chernobyl and Fukushima, which have caused serious harm around the world and led to a perception of danger associated with nuclear power. But we also have to remember that radiation is a two-sided sword. There are beneficial uses of radiation as well, particularly in the medical field, in diagnosis and therapy, and widely used in saving lives when used appropriately and used safely. And even in industry, radiation is also used in industrial radiography, for example, in testing pipelines for leaks. So there are benefits and there are risks associated with radiation exposure, as there are with many technologies. Let's jump back more than 125 years ago. Originally, when radiation first burst on the scene, the discovery of radioactivity, the discovery of radiation were both front-page news in the New York Times in the 1890s. Marvelous cures of cancer attributed to radium. So people thought that radiation and radioactivity was this wonderful new discovery that was going to help mankind. And indeed, as we got into the 20s, people used radiation and used the word radium and radioactivity to sell product and to convince people that there was some benefit of putting radiation within products or just using the word radiation in describing a product or a radium suppositories, radium water. These were all popular themes in the 20s and even in the early 30s. At the same time, there was a growing awareness of the danger of radiation exposure. Actually, 1 year after the discovery of radioactivity, a scientist reported a phenomenon called radiation cataract in a rabbit model. It was kind of ignored by the literature for many years, but even at the turn of the 1900s, we knew that technologists in England, in London Hospital, who were experimenting and using X-ray diagnostically, were developing horrible malformations, horrible diseases, cancers of their hands, which they were putting in the X-ray beam to actually calibrate the X-ray beam. So we were aware, in some sense, of the dangers of radiation exposure, but also fascinated by the promise of radiation exposure, and certainly its use in medicine. As we moved into the 20s and 30s, we became aware of what are called the radium girls, those young women who were assigned to paint radium dials on watches to make them glow in the dark, phenomena that first happened during World War I and then moved into the 20s and 30s. And during the process of painting these dials, they would take the paintbrushes and put them in their mouths, called tipping, to give them sharp points, and they got enormous ingestion of radium-226, leading to horrible downstream consequences, bone cancers, jaw necrosis, anemia, and many other diseases. It took many years and many cases before courts finally recognized the relationship between this occupational exposure and human health risks. But one of the first large-scale cases where they showed a relationship between occupational radiation exposure and serious health consequences. As we moved into World War II and the atomic bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the dangers of radiation became forefront in our minds, and certainly during the 50s, Hollywood and the popular media capitalized on this phenomena and certainly used this to sell movies and books and cartoons. 50-foot-tall woman, Godzilla, etc., all capitalized on our fear of radiation. So much so that in the 50s, New York Times had a headline that said, "Scientists term radiation a peril to the future of man." They thought that radiation was an existential risk, primarily because of the hereditary consequences of radiation exposure. At that time, people believed that hereditary consequences of radiation exposure were the most serious consequence of excess exposure to radiation. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. In fact, today, we believe the biggest danger from radiation exposure is to the developing fetus. Secondary risk is to cancer. Third risk is genetic risk. So we reverse the order of the way we think about that now. The other thing that's really important, something that I talk to our public health students about all the time, is our perception and our reaction to radiation exposure. I love this quote because it's not just the radiation, it's how we respond to the radiation. And I can give you a couple of examples. In Chernobyl, after the accident, there were some 600,000 young soldiers who were tasked with cleaning up that power plant. They were exposed to a fairly high level of radiation. We don't have good estimates because they didn't have good dosimetry back then, but we have a rough idea of how much radiation they got. But they were all convinced that they were getting death sentences from going to work there. So what did they do? They changed their lifestyle. They smoked too much, they drank too much, they adopted unhealthy lifestyles, and they had enormous levels of stress. And rates of diseases caused by lifestyle changes have skyrocketed in that population. So they're dying from the consequences of their perception of the risk not from the direct relationship to radiation exposure. We see the same in Fukushima. Those 300 workers who actually helped save that plant and helped save Japan from the consequences of that meltdown, we do know what doses they got. Because unlike Chernobyl, they wore badges. And so we know pretty precisely the doses those workers got. And I will tell you a little bit later that we can calculate pretty accurately what their actual lifetime risk is for cancer, but they weren't told that. What they were told was, you saved Japan, thank you for doing this heroic job. Most of them thought they were going to die. So they, again, adopted behaviors which led to mortality and morbidity. So one of our tasks in public health, and one of the tasks of public officials, is to accurately talk to people about relative risk, perceived risk, and real risk, and cause them to adopt behaviors to improve their health, not to stress about it. The World Health Organization thinks the largest health consequence of Chernobyl and Fukushima is mental health and our reaction to those accidents and how people behaved after those accidents, not the actual direct risk from the radiation exposure. Today, we still have emerging health concerns about radiation exposure. Storage of radioactive waste, continuing concerns about nuclear weapons production, overuse or overexposure to diagnostic X-rays, occupational exposures, radon exposures in homes, something that's developed over the last 20 to 30 years. Something new, widespread uranium contamination in water supplies around this country, an area of interest, a Superfund interest in our department. And something Angela touched on a little bit, synergistic risks, combined chemical exposures. What is the risk of combination of arsenic and uranium exposure? What is the combination of external gamma exposure and some internal chemical exposure? We're still trying to wrap our hands around that and try to assess what actual risks are, what are the mechanisms, the biochemical and molecular mechanisms underlying these risks. A couple of examples. Colleagues of mine at Columbia University about more than a decade ago published this article in the New England Journal saying that there were real risks associated with overuse of CT, and they got tremendous blowback for this article, saying you were unnecessarily scaring the public, unnecessarily scaring doctors. Since that time, there have been two large epidemiological studies, one with the English Health Service, one in Australia, that actually, when they looked at records of children who had gotten CTs over a 30 to 40 year span, the numbers of children who got what were likely brain cancers from head CTs matched the estimates they have in this article. So there is a danger for overuse. I'm not saying we shouldn't use CT. CT has real benefit for saving lives, but overuse of CT also has real risks associated with it. An area of interest of mine is radiation cataract, a type of cataract that's caused by overexposure of the lens to radiation. That's something that a number of international organizations have been involved in. We've published a lot about this. Again, occupational exposure, lack of protection to the head, to the neck, to the eyes, leads to downstream ocular consequences. And within a variety of different scenarios, overexposure can lead to untoward health consequences. We talked about radon. I don't know how many of you know the story of Stanley Watrous, but many years ago, Stanley, turns out, he lived in a house that has the highest radon concentration ever measured in a basement in this country. And the work that they did in understanding what, Stanley worked in a nuclear power plant. One day he went to work and all the alarms went off. And people said, okay, Stanley, what did you do? What did you take out of this nuclear power plant? It turns out he didn't do anything. His home was the source of his contamination. And that led to our understanding about there are certain regions of this country have excess radon in their basements. Natural radon occurring from the natural decay of uranium. And radon itself is a gas. Radon is not the damaging agent, it's polonium, which is a solid particle, which is a decay product of radon, which can embed into our lungs deeply or go through the lungs and actually get through our body and attack other tissues as well. I told you an area of interest developing in our department is uranium and water supply. It turns out that there's high levels of uranium and water across the country in water supplies. And we're trying to understand what that means for human health. It's not just the radiation, it's also the heavy metal consequences. Uranium is a heavy metal. It has its own nephrotoxicity associated with the fact that it's a heavy metal, not just a radioactive metal as well. And lastly, synergistic risk. The combination of these exposures may be greater than the additive effect of each of these individuals. And a good example of that is smoking and uranium exposure or radon exposure. You can see a smoker has a much greater risk of developing lung cancer because of the consequence of the combination of smoking and radon exposure. So last fall, the EPA issued a new report on risk assessment of coal combustion. It was in part, I think, to some of the work that Billy and his colleagues did at the Kingston spill. And in this report, they said that the radiation-associated health risks associated with coal ash have been underestimated. And in fact, the analysis concluded that coal ash may have a risk because of combined arsenic and radiation exposure, some 35 times higher than we previously estimated. And now they suggest that the elevated cancer risk from ingestion of arsenic and radium and irradiation from gamma radiation, from radium decay, may be a serious human health concern. Unfortunately, coal ash is widely used across this country as structural fill, largely unregulated, and probably poses a much greater environmental risk than we've thought about before. I certainly knew nothing about coal ash 4 years ago. So this has now been picked up. There are a number of articles now talking about risks of coal ash and our concerns about coal ash. So let's step back just a second. Allow me to get a little nerdy with you, talk a little bit about radiation. Okay, what is radiation? Where does it come from? Why is it a health risk? What are the human health effects of radiation exposure? Radiation is all around us. We can divide radiation into two components, ionizing and non-ionizing. Light is radiation. Sunlight is radiation. Radio waves are radiation. Well, what we're concerned about is ionizing radiation. Radioactivity, when we think about it in the popular press, we think about ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is radiation that's energetic enough to dislodge an electron from an atom and to ionize it, to give it a charge. Some of the examples of ionizing radiation are alpha particles, beta particles, gamma rays, heavy ions, neutrons. These are all ionizing because they have enough energy to knock electrons out of orbit. That's what damages cells. That's what damages tissue. We can divide ionizing radiation into three parts based on their penetration ability. Alpha particles, who are actually quite dangerous, don't have very much penetration depth. If they're in contact with a cell, they can damage it quite a bit, roughly 20-fold greater than beta and gamma rays, but they're easily stopped by things like paper, by 10 centimeters of air. It's ingestion of alpha particles that cause the most concern. Beta particles, which are essentially electrons, have some penetration depth, but they stop at a couple of millimeters of skin. They don't go deep into our body. And gamma rays and X-rays are also a waveform of ionizing energy, have great penetrating ability. And radium-226 is a gamma emitter, and it's the gamma emission from radium-226 that we're concerned about because it can travel great distances and pass through fairly dense materials. So why are we concerned with this? We don't know how to perceive risk. We can't smell it, we can't see it, we can't taste it. We don't understand radiation. Human beings don't have a way of assessing risk. And consequently, we imagine all kinds of things like the Hulk and Godzilla and other things as a consequence of radiation exposure, because we don't understand biologically what is really happening with radiation. But we do have an understanding about how cells get damaged and what happens to cells. And one of the things I talk about all the time with my students is biological plausibility. Is there a biologically plausible mechanism by which an exposure can lead to an outcome? And with radiation, there is. We have well understood mechanisms how radiation can damage DNA, can lead to uncontrolled cell division, and in the right cell or the wrong cell, at the wrong time, in the wrong place, can lead to a cancer outcome. We shouldn't also ignore the fact that radiation has multiple non-cancer outcomes as well. Cardiovascular disease, pulmonary outcomes, immunological outcomes, and ocular outcomes that are independent of mutation and cancer outcomes. Why are we so concerned about cancer? Because most of the things in cells, RNA, protein, membranes, can be fixed, can be replaced, can be repaired. The damage to the genetic content, to the information content of our cells is not. And when it's misrepaired or damaged, that leads to downstream consequences, one of which is a cancer outcome. And going back to the synergistic theme, it's not just ionizing radiation, but it's the sum total of all these other environmental exposures, which in context together may lead to damage we don't recognize individually, or the sum total is greater than the individuals. just to reemphasize something I said before, when we think about radiation, the risk to the unborn embryo is greatest, the risk of cancer underneath that, and the hereditary risk, while biologically plausible, is probably orders of magnitude less than the first two risks as well. Another take-home message I want you to understand about radiation is I will never tell you there's any safe level of radiation. What I will tell you, at very low exposures, there's very low risk. And there's a linear dose relationship between exposure and risk when it comes to carcinogenesis. That's now been shown in literally hundreds of thousands of epidemiological cohorts. We can pretty precisely tell you lifetime risk for cancer based on the dose you got. Zero dose, zero risk. Small dose, small dose risk, rising with time. Things like radiation cataract or cardiovascular disease may have a threshold, which we're still trying to define, but cancer risk in mutation is a linear, no dose, no threshold response. All right, coal ash. Coal ash contains a variety of radioactive elements, radium, uranium, and thorium. In particular, we're worried most about 226 radium. We're concerned about alpha particle production and gamma particle production. What people don't realize is that coal ash and burning coal is much more dangerous than actually a nuclear power plant in terms of emissions. In 2007, this was first reported. We've known that since then, roughly 100 times more radiation coming from burning coal than coming from a nuclear power plant. And there are all kinds of decay products, and each one of these are radioactive decay daughter elements from the decay of uranium-238, uranium-235, and thorium-222, and all of them have been well described. And the literature is full of reports about radiation in coal ash, but what the literature is not full of is reports of the health consequences of exposure to radiation in fly ash. The EPA is starting to recognize this. If you go on the EPA website, you can see information about radioactivity in coal ash. And another important take-home message is where the coal comes from matters. Different coals, different sources have different levels of radiation as well. So it's important to understand, and it may provide a signature for exposure by looking at the ratio of the various radioactive elements. And this was described 30 years ago as well. Again, we're just starting to relate this to human health outcomes. The basic science about the radiation component has been well known. So now this report came out in October. This has now been picked up. A number of organizations are starting to look at this and look around the country at what are the risks and what do we learn from Kingston we can apply throughout the world. In North Carolina in particular, coal ash is extensively used as fill material. There have been a number of concerns in Mooresville, North Carolina, and other communities as well about the health risks associated with it. You can see the quantity of fill that's being used just in Mooresville, North Carolina. Enormous amounts of fill, enormous potential risk from radiation exposure and other chemicals as well. So in conclusion, I think the teamwork that we had on the Kingston coal ash spill, the scientists, the doctors, the lawyers, the engineers, the hygienists all worked together, and our combined body of knowledge was successful to the outcome of this litigation. And I think we can apply the lessons and the techniques we used in the Kingston coal ash spill to other environmental accidents as well to prevent this kind of thing from happening. As Billy said, 1 billion gallons of sludge released downstream, the largest industrial spill in our history, in our country's history. And I think as a result of our science is why this happened and why we were able to get a successful outcome to this case. So recognize our teamwork, and always close with somewhat of a humorous slide. And then Billy, I'll let you conclude.
I just need one quick minute. I want to thank Dr. Angela Hind, Dr. Norman Kleiman, flying across the country with me. I want to thank all the attorneys that supported me in the case. I want to thank in particular Gary Davis, my new law partner at the law firm Davis, Johnston & Ringer, PC, based out of Asheville, North Carolina. You can visit us at enviroattorney.com, and I invite you to do that. So thank you, everyone, for your time.